Welcome to Celtic State of Mind. I'm John Dykes, and tonight I am delighted to be joined once again by Kevin Graham for another instalment of Screamacelica. Kevin, how are you enjoying the 9 in a row celebrations, first and foremost?
It's been really, really strange, quite surreal. I didn't think I was going to have an emotional attachment, that emotional reaction, but I did get a wee bit of a buzz when we were confirmed. You always had in the back of your mind that there might have been some skullduggery the Scottish League might have got up to, but obviously common sense prevailed for once. It's been good to have a wee look back, because we've been over couple of months without football now, you've actually forgot how good we were for January onwards, so it's been good to have a wee sit and focus on football, because I don't think a lot of us have been focusing on the football over the last couple of months, just with everything that's happening, so it's good to get a line drawn under it, and it's good to have a wee look back, especially over the last 9 years as well. It's been good to have a wee look back, and I don't think myself, I'm not really looking towards 10 yet, because I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know what the league's going to look like, but it's good to sit there and take in what we've achieved and give a nod to Neil Lennon.
I think the words that Neil Lennon has used have been absolutely exquisite in their delivery, and anybody who is, going with the narrative of tainted titles or asterisks or any of that carry on, I'm just not listening to that. And you're talking about skullduggery. I think the skullduggery has probably been left to the SFA, who obviously have announced that they will be taking no further action on Resolution 12. So that is another subject for another day. We're here to talk about an album from 1993, Kevin. And we are also going to be looking at the musical landscape at that time, and also what Celtic were up to. So first and foremost, Kevin, tell me, what is the album, the date, and your memories of that LP?
The album was released on the 11th of May 1993, and it's Modern Life is Rubbish by Blur. Now, it's a groundbreaking album. It's probably the album that threw the grenade of Britpop over the trenches and into the mainstream. It's an album which, at the time, and even up until recently, I was probably of the opinion that it was a great big departure from the previous album, Leisure. But having listened back to it over the last couple of days, I think the real big departure was their image. And there's some songs that are on Modern Life is Rubbish that could have been on Leisure. Songs like Turn It Up, Resigned, Oily Water and Blue Jeans. They've still got that kind of baggy influence. Well, let's not beat about the bush here, like For Tomorrow, which was a single off this album, is one of the greatest singles ever released in the history of modern day music, in my opinion. It is an excellence in songwriting, and yes, it wears its heart and its influences on its sleeve, but what a fantastic piece of work. And even the single before that, the single that didn't end up on the album before that, Pop Scene as well, showed Blur's change of direction. And this album, I mean, it's a classic album. For me, it's Blur's best album. It's set up that sort of mid-90s explosion of sports, tracky tops, Adidas Gazelles, you name it. This album sort of kicked it off. And the story behind the album is basically Blur had released Leisure. Turned out they were in debt with quite a large bit of money, and so they got sent to America on the roller coaster tour with My Bloody Valentine and the Jesus and Mary Chain and Dinosaur Jr.
No bad lineup.
And It's a great lineup. That lineup actually did play at the SEC. I'm sure. I never went to that gig, but so they were sent on a tour of America, and they hated it. They hated everything American. They hated grunge. They were basically ignored on the tour by the American audiences. And bizarrely enough, when they came back, the British press were all over Swed, and the band didn't like that either. So they sort of changed direction. And one thing I've noticed, listening back to this album's like long, and the album's like just under an hour, which is a lengthy album. And when I had a look to see why this was, it's basically because when they presented it to the record company rejected it and says, you need to write a couple of singles. And the last two things that were written for the album were For Tomorrow and Chemical World. So they were tagged onto the album that they had delivered previously. I'm going to go back to something that Dominic Diamond says in the podcast last week when you interviewed him, Paul. And he spoke about when you're skint and up against a wall, you can sometimes do your best work. And for the band to write For Tomorrow after getting telt, basically, you've got to write a couple of singles, and coming up with an utterly classic song, for me, proves that point completely.
I think when you look at art, if you're too comfortable and you're not fighting for anything, then it's just painting by numbers. And I think that's true of music, of art, of film, writing, all of these things. And it is interesting that Dominic Diamond said that, and I can understand that from a writing perspective as well. It must be frustrating for a band. I know Kevin Miles, going a few weeks further back, Kevin Miles mentioned how once you get onto that major, and obviously Kevin was signed to Sony, then there isn't the same freedom, as an artist, to write an album, to write a song, to release it the way you want to release it. And I think any band who is going through that process of, this was an album that you rate it as the finest, and James Barker from Ace City Racers, who was influenced massively by Blur and who was on the podcast a few months back, he reckons it's one of his favourite albums as well. But obviously it certainly hasn't been their most successful, but I think what it does is it paves the way, Kevin. I think the Verve were the same. The previous album to maybe their biggest album is a better album, and it paves the way for the kind of commercialism and the popularity, if you like. But looking at Blur, and having mentioned James from Ace City Racers, who obviously wrote the intro and outro music to A Celtic State of Mind, which has now been listened to 1.2 million times, was the connection here is Stephen Street. Stephen Street produced Modern Life is Rubbish, and obviously also produced Ace City Racers, who were our live session band a couple of months ago now. But yeah, all that kind of linkage, and at that time you were saying there, changing direction, sometimes it's superb to do that. If anyone out there has not watched Elvis Costello's Spectacle show on YouTube, Kevin, and yourself as well, you would really enjoy it, where he has an in-depth conversation with someone else from the music world, and people like Bruce Springsteen, for example. And you look at Bruce Springsteen and the way that he has changed and moved throughout his career and adapted. David Bowie is a massive example of that as well. But there are other bands, and I think Blur have been accused of this in the past, who are almost like musical chameleons, where they just change to suit what's happening around about them. And I think they were criticised for that around the kind of baggy scene. There's No Other Way was written with that drum beat in mind and all this kind of stuff. Do you think on this album, even though there was a pressure from the record industry, this was a more true to themselves style LP?
I'm going to defend them here. As I says a couple of minutes ago, I don't think it's that much a radical departure, because even on Leisure they had the Englishness of Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, and they had the pop sensibility of Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd. And I do think this is just is it a natural progression? It probably is. This album was probably always in them. And I don't think it's been they're basically kicking against the tide, coming out sounding like the Kinks and the Small Faces and sounding really English at this point. It's not as if they've jumped on an absolute bandwagon. I mean, the term Britpop was coined by Stuart McConey, and it wasn't about bands like, it was about bands not sounding English but singing about England or elements of English life. like Swed, like Pulp, the Auteurs were mentioned in that as well. So it was Blur that really brung back in the mod sort of angle to Britpop, which everybody sort of remembers it being Britpop with the RAF symbols and stuff like that. But I'm going to defend them and actually say they always had. If you listen back to Leisure now, and if you listen to Leisure and listen to Modern Life is Rubbish straight after it, there is a definite English Syd Barrett influence in both records.
I mean, I think they're innovators. I mean, it's not something that I subscribe to, but I know that the music press have certainly criticised Blur for that. I think Damon Albarn, when you look at his output, not just with Blur, but with his various other musical concepts and projects, is a musical genius, actually. You know, when you look at what he's done in various different genres of music, Kevin. I've always been a big fan. This Blur v Oasis thing that happened a wee while after Modern Life is Rubbish, never subscribed to that either, because I was buying all the singles and all the albums from both bands at that time, you know. And I mean, I've seen Blur live. They were tremendous live, really, really strong. I mean, Coxon is a tremendous guitarist. You know, his solo output as well, Kevin. I don't know if you ever explored his solo albums, but
I have, yes.
Just brilliant musicianship, and actually quite a quirky voice, which I quite liked as well. But I totally agree with you. What's your high points when you look down the track listing? And I know that you do your research by going back and listening to these albums, resurrecting them if you've not been listening to them for a while. What's the high points for you from the LP?
I've obviously For Tomorrow, fantastic. I love the Melancholy Entered album. We Resigned, and then you've got the song before that, the punky sort of coping. I love the way that they've got the throwaway music hall, a commercial break, the characters. I think the album as well, and you mentioned the Blur and Oasis thing there, eh? And I always thought that a lot of the lyrics that Albarn and Noel Gallagher actually wrote were about escaping. In the albums, there's a lot of themes on Modern Life is Rubbish about escaping modern life. And for me, that's no different from Liam from Oasis singing about, I'm going to spend my days in the sunshine. It's just a different take on the same theme. You're talking about seeing Blur live. I actually saw them. This album was released May 1993, and I went to the Reading Festival in August 1993, and they were extremely high up on the bill in the main tent at this point. So they done a mixture that night. It's actually on YouTube, their set. So they done a mixture of songs from Leisure and Modern Life is Rubbish. And you could tell at that point that they had a bit of momentum behind them. They were very spiky, very punky. That night as well, I had a tape recording of this, and I lost it, but obviously some kind gentleman or lady has put it up on YouTube for us, And it's the first time that they play Parklife live. It's the first time that they play Bank Holiday live, which would then become the next album, So I've got very, very fond memories of this album and seeing them at that point. The next time I went to see them after that was, I'm sure it would have been the Glasgow Plaza after Girls and Boys was released. And that was a band on a meteoric rise at that point, and whose audience was changing, whose audience was becoming far younger than guys like myself kicking about. Mind you, I was only, what age would I have been then? I was only maybe 18, 19 at the time. But even then, the audience was younger than me. And I remember being that night at the Plaza, feeling quite out of place, that it was full of screaming teenage lasses. And
that's the Damon Albarn effect, isn't it, really? In the 1990s, certainly. That's a demo effect. But, you mentioned the Reading Festival, and that just springs to mind another band, actually, because we will be moving on to other releases from this year. In the third part of the show, Rage Against the Machine, and we'll come back to that album because there was an excellent article on axrom.net this week from Martin Donaldson all about the impact of that album. But before we have a look at Celtic in a moment or two, Kevin, Modern Life is Rubbish, just as a concept, is it?
Oh, tough question. Very psychological question at this time.
We've had a couple of months really to ponder modern life. We've had a couple of months to ponder the foibles of day-to-day modern life with the wastage that we have and the technology we've got at our fingertips, and the real simplistic things in life have been missed. Meeting up with people, communicating face-to-face, going about your day-to-day life, going to your work, something you take for granted often. You know, if you're 20, 30 years down the line in your working life and, you know, you would just fancy a day off here and there. And it's made a lot of people, I'm sure, ponder just the day-to-day drudgery of what you think is modern life. And I wonder, is it rubbish? Or are we going to come out the other end of this pandemic, Kevin, maybe with a newfound respect for the simple things in life?
I would hope so. I really do hope so. And I mean, the aspects of modern life that I don't like is everybody's very materialistic. Everything's very disposable. Everything's very quick. Social media's probably got a lot to do with that. Things grow, fester quite quickly on social media, and the world can seem very, very nasty. I've never had much time for the materialistic and the overly capitalist modus operandi that people have got. It's all about making money. It's all about being bigger and better than your next door neighbour. I don't get that. And over the last couple of months, as you say, we've had to have a look at that and we've had to reevaluate that. And this has changed how we probably see ourselves. It's changed how I see myself. I've had quite a bit to deal with over the last couple of months. And I'm sitting here wondering what my future is going to be like when I come out the other side. Will I eventually make that plunge to change the direction? Maybe get off the rat race and go and do something else? But it's extremely difficult to do, and with other commitments that you've actually got. And it's strange, I was saying to somebody today, it's like you would expect to have more time sitting in the house, and it feels like you've actually got less time. It feels like time's more slipping away for you than what it does usually when you're on the rat race. And it's really, really interesting. I think myself, I'm going to be far, I'm not that I'm a materialistic person anyway, but it's made me look at myself a bit more than what I usually would have done. And I just need to wait and see. Really, that's because I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't think nobody knows what it's going to look like. We don't know what music's going to look like live music anyway. We don't know what football's going to look like, live football. So I don't know what my employment's going to look like when I go back. So it's extremely difficult to make any sort of decisions whatsoever.
It is, and I just think, Blur, modern life is rubbish, 1993, here we are, 2020, and maybe it is a bit rubbish. Maybe we need to get back to the basics, Kevin, but as you say, it's very difficult. One final point in this album, Kevin, brilliant front cover, beautiful bit of artwork.
It is a great bit of artwork, eh? Aye, it's a great album cover. I think Blur, it was the Flying Mallard, eh? It was the Mallard, eh?
It's the locomotive mallard, the subject of the album's cover. Looking at that though, you may well, you've just said there that although you've got all the time in the world at the moment, it's as if the world's, running away for you like a steam train. So maybe there's something in that. Modern life is indeed rubbish. And, before you know it, you're 40-something and you're wondering what the hell happened. But, at least in the early 40s, Kevin, we're sitting here with 9 in a row in the back pocket, moving on to 10, and who knows where else. But 1993 marked a significant point in my life because it was the year that I went to my first ever gig. I went to go and see U2 at Celtic Park of all places, and it was the Zoo TV tour, but they were promoting the Zooropa album. And I went there with a good pal of mine, a good Celtic fan who I used to go to the games with back in the day, and we went through and watched U2. They were supported by Utah Saints and the Stereo MCs. So this was my first gig, and a very memorable gig indeed. Now, Celtic, we've just mentioned Celtic Park. My memories actually of that gig were that the Jungle had seats in it. The Jungle had seats, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. So let's have a look at Celtic at that point. That would be the very, very end, Kevin, of season 1992-93. And interestingly enough, we did have the Celtic collection on the Axon Video Club, Celtic Collection 4, with a very special guest, Andy Payton, who was answering questions for people watching that video a couple of weeks back. Talk to us about where Celtic were back when modern life was rubbish.
We were basically coming off Liam Brady's second season. As you mentioned, that their seats were just put in the Jungle. And when you look back at Brady's record, he had been there for 2 seasons. It was utterly amazing for me that we were facing a third season with Liam Brady. When you put put it to like today's modern standards. I mean, even with today's modern standards, you probably think that Liam Brady wouldn't have got past Neuchâtel Xamax, which was his 19th game in charge today. I mean, when you look back on it, it's quite obvious that the club couldn't afford to sack him, or he wouldn't have been there for season 3. We wouldn't be going into the following season with Liam Brady in charge if we could afford to sack him, So we weren't in a very good place, truthfully. That would have been the 4th season in a row that we finished outside the top 2 as well. So we weren't in a very good place at all. So that summer saw Joe Jordan come in for Hearts. Well, it was Hearts had sacked him basically, and he came in as a fabled defensive coach. But it didn't seem to make much difference from... Again, we've got to have a look at this. I mean, Brady's sides were quite decent at times, and they could pull out a couple of results when the pressure was off. So you would always go into the new season with a bit of hope. But basically, at the start of Brady's 3rd season, all hope sort of disappeared. He brought in Pat McGinley after he sold Joe Muller back to Aberdeen. Stevie Fulton went to Bolton, and everything just sort of fell apart. We lost another semi-final to Rangers with 10 men again, So we're in a very good place.
No, we weren't. And I think that could be quite clearly seen when we watched the Celtic Collection 4, which was the brainchild of a certain Terry Cassidy. And all these names, Kevin, keep cropping up when we're speaking on a Celtic State of Mind. But everything's connected in Celtic history, and you've got to talk about the bad times. We've just won 9 in a row, and we're talking about the days where we were struggling to get beyond the first couple of rounds in Europe. I mean, so when the Blur album came out, it came out probably with 1 game left to go in the 1992-93 season. The most amazing thing was really that Liam Brady was given 3 pre-seasons to get it right, and he never did. It was interesting to hear Spencer Vignes talking about Brady's time at Brighton and Hove Albion. Kevin, I've never really spoken to anybody with a Brighton connection around Liam Brady's time there, but he was looked upon very fondly by the Brighton support, by all accounts. But what Spencer said was that they were a basket case of a club at that time, and I said, well, he left one to join one, because so were Celtic. We were coming into the really grim era of the board being incompetent, and they were up against a financially doped Rangers at the time, without any shadow of a doubt. But Liam Brady bought poorly. He bought big and he bought poorly. I mean, we were moving into an era where he'd already shelled out for Gary Gillespie, Tony Mowbray, Tony Cascarino, and that was your 3 £1 million plus players. And then moving into the second season, which is the one that we're referring to just now, he brings in Stuart Slater, Andy Payton, Rudy Vata. The big money signing of Stuart Slater didn't work. It was interesting, Kevin, when we were watching the Celtic Collection video, some of the performances that Slater had. He had a good game against Rangers, he played well against Borussia Dortmund, but a massive big money flop, wasn't he? 1.5 million quid.
Definitely. There was a lot of disappointments round about that time, and basically when you look back on Liam Brady's time at Celtic, he did have poor signings. His team were extremely inconsistent, they couldn't defend, but eventually when we're going into season 3, what we're talking about there is he had no money. He basically kept Pat McGinley dangling until he sold Joe Muller. And as you say, the big money signings like Slater, some people handle Glasgow's Goldfish Bowl and some people don't. But looking back now, I've really got nothing against any players who couldn't handle being at Celtic Football Club at that time, because we were an utter mess. You mentioned the Brighton guy there, and he says that as well about Liam Brady. He says, my club was a mess at that point, and probably nobody could have turned it round. And we could maybe say the same for Liam. Maybe we should cut him a wee bit of slack here, But as you say, it was a painful time. We've just won 9 in a row. And it's funny that you mentioned those videos, I've started watching them back, and I'm going, I was at that game. And there's a bit of misty-eye nostalgia comes over, going, by the way, we weren't that bad. But we were, when you look at the grand scheme of things. We did have some decent players, but we couldn't get them to gel. And the club was an utter basket case of a club at that point. I mean, we appoint a defensive coach in Joe Jordan, and as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we lost 1-0 in the League Cup semi-final to Rangers again. In the following game, I think we lost to St Johnstone 2-1, and Liam Brady resigned. Now, everybody expected Joe Jordan to get the job, but Joe Jordan resigned a day after it because his best pal, Lou Macari, called him to say Celtic had offered him the job. So it just shows you the absolute incompetence of the people who were running the club at that point, that they didn't realise that Joe Jordan's best pal was Lou Macari.
And the chicanery that was going on, and they had history of doing things like that, sacking Frank Connor, and then the Davy Hay, Billy McNeil thing could have been dealt with a lot better, Kevin. So they had history. They were incompetent, absolutely. At the end of the season, around about the time of the Blur album being released, Celtic beat Dundee 2-0 on the 15th of May 1993 in what was called the Jungle's Last Stand. And I remember that well. I remember the certificates they were handing out, and that was the last stand before the Jungle Terrace became seated. And it just, my undying memory of that was obviously in the pre-season, going into Liam Brady's third season, as you've mentioned, and going along to see U2 at Celtic Park. And then we've gone in and we've gone over to Italy, which was probably at the insistence of the Brady and Jordan partnership, and that was where we had our pre-season friendlies. And as you say, Pat McGinley came in, we couldn't afford them. Liam Brady sold a lot of players, I think, Kevin, who had been pivotal in the centenary season, and also in the season that followed that in 1989. And, we got rid of the likes of Derek White, Chris Morris, Anton Rogan, Joe Miller, who you've already mentioned. And some of these players, I think, could have actually done a shift for us. And, managers want to put their own stamp on a club. But when you're spending millions and millions and you're not getting any of that back, really. I mean, Tony Cascarino, the only saving grace there was we were able to swap him for Tom Boyd. Tony Mowbray's longevity at the club probably meant that he paid a substantial part of that fee back, but he was never, for me, a £1 million defender. He gave us the huddle, he gave us that, but he was just a big... I mean, one of the matches you might be referring to was the 5-4 game at Brockville the previous season, and Tony Mowbray basically, saved the ball on the line and got his marching orders. Falkirk went 4-2 up, and then somehow Celtic pulled it back, and I think it was a John Collins winner about 3 minutes into injury time, and you were in the Falkirk end, rumour has it.
in the Falkirk end, aye.
But yeah, the whole Liam Brady out, Lou Macari in, and then the interim period, Frank Connor taking charge, guiding Celtic through stormy waters, unbeaten. We beat Sporting Lisbon 1-0. A big feature of that period again was the fact that we had a strike force. I mean, Andy Payton was brought in. He was swapped for Chris Morris. So Andy Payton was swapped for Chris Morris. And it was around about that time we also had Charlie Nicholas, Jerry Craney and Tommy Coyne. And I think Brady was counting on Coyne joining Man City. Man City had tabled a £500,000 bid for Coyne. So instead of just selling him, we had to bring in another striker. By the time we brought in Payton, for a swap deal to save some money to buy Stuart Slater, the Coyne deal was off the table, so we were left with 4 strikers. And Craney, for me, he was a prolific goal scorer throughout his time at Celtic, and it's the old argument that you and I have already discussed or debate with regards to Celtic producing a prolific goal scorer. And Craney, I would argue, although Sean Maloney's been thrown into the pot, I would argue Craney was probably the last guy that we've produced that scored a lot of goals. Again,
watching these videos back, I actually forgot how prolific and how deadly Jerry Craney was inside the penalty box, and how many goals he had actually scored for Celtic at that time. He must have been, again, it's extremely difficult for me to remember back, but he must have been rated as one of the Scotland's top prospects when he was banging in the goals for us at that time. And you're coming probably at a time where Scottish strikers were beginning to get in short supply. So he must have been getting good press and been getting boosted up quite a bit. It's been one of the more pleasurable aspects of watching those videos has been seeing Craney again scoring goals. It's probably a wee gentle reminder of possibly a missed opportunity for Celtic there, a missed opportunity for the player, maybe more than anything.
You look at some of the European goals, Sporting Lisbon I've already mentioned, scoring against Borussia Dortmund, and he scored against Rangers more than once. He was prolific. I think, obviously, you never know what's going on in the background, Kevin, in terms of attitude and application at training, and the fact that he came into the side, he scored a lot of goals. How did that affect him and his attitude and his approach to the game? I remember around about that time, the player you thought was going to come through and score goals would have been Jerry Britton, because he was scoring, shed loads of goals for the reserves, and then Craney got his chance and he just couldn't stop scoring. I think that the reason he didn't have a longer career at Celtic was because we were offered decent money for him, and at that time we were going to take decent money for probably anybody except for Paul McStay at that time. But Craney, it is unfortunate because he scored a lot of goals, but he graduated from that brilliant under-21 team. Remember the Scotland under-21 team that had the great run in the European Championships, and it was players like Ray McKinnon and Phil O'Donnell was in that team. Great Scottish side, and I think, I would need to check, but I'm pretty sure that they were coached by Craig Brown, and they got to the semi-finals of European Championships. So Jerry Craney, very, very highly rated indeed, and his career just dwindled, went down south, played with Portsmouth, Man City, and around about that time as well, as grim as supporting Celtic was, the over the horizon was into 1994 was the Fergus McCann takeover, but I'm sure we'll talk about that with another LP in the future. Kevin, let's talk about some of the other albums that were being released in 1993. What sticks out for you?
In 1993, I would have been listening to The Verve, A Storm in Heaven. I would have been swayed, obviously. You've already mentioned U2. Zeropa was a big album that year. New Order, Republic, preceded by the great single called Regret. And James released the album called Laid as well. So I would have been listening to them quite heavily that year. I mean, I've already mentioned I was at the Reading Festival that year, and New Order were headlining on the Sunday night. So they were fantastic on the Sunday night on the main stage. And you mentioned Rage Against the Machine. I think you're going to talk about Rage Against the Machine. But they were headlining the Friday night at that Reading Festival. And the whole day on the Friday, the whole atmosphere of the festival was building up for them. And when they came on, the place absolutely exploded. I'm not really a big Rage Against the Machine fan, but you couldn't help but be impressed with their energy and what they'd done to 50,000 people that night in a field off the M25. It was unbelievable. It was really, really spectacular.
Rage Against the Machine Reading Festival for me, a few years later actually, was without doubt one of the most powerful live performances I've ever seen. It's an album, and it's actually a band, because for me they've never written a bad album, but it's a band who are one of the most important bands in my musical lifetime, and I still listen to that album. That album for me is still in my top 5 most listened to albums, Kevin. Listen to it regularly. I think the lyrical content is so relevant these days, all these years later. The musicianship's just incredible. Very, very talented and important band. I mean, you mentioned also New Order. Don't know if you've ever read Substance by Peter Hook. It is an absolutely outrageously good book on New Order. He's written 3 books, and this is the one after his Joy Division book, obviously, Substance. And I mean, the relationship breakdown of him and Bernard Sumner is sad. It's grotty. It's horrible. And it just shows you how art can tear people apart. And it certainly did with A2. They don't speak anymore. But that book, Hookie is pretty brutal in it. And you always know that I've never actually read Sumner's riposte to that, but I will do. I'll get round to that at some point. But it's just terrible how a room full of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 mates who had been through so much, with Joy Division and the death of Ian Curtis. People call it artistic differences, but they just can't get on, and to the point where they virtually despise each other and they can't be in the same room as each other, Kevin. It's really quite sad, but I would recommend that as a book for anybody out there. You look at,
you were mentioning like New Order and that there. I mean, you often wonder how U2 have never fell out, like the success that they've had, and I think it's maybe because they go long periods without working with each other. Maybe that's how they survive.
I've often wondered because any album that they release, is followed up by a 3-year world tour, and you've still got the original lineup in the band, and that is quite impressive when you think about that. I mean, they're old guys now, so I'm pretty sure that they're not going to split up. But yeah, I have often wondered that. Some of the other albums I've already mentioned: Rage, In Utero by Nirvana, by the music filtering through from my brother's record collection. Not a massive fan of Nirvana, but I can appreciate what they did and what they did well. Paul Weller dropped the Paul Weller Movement moniker and released what he's good at, and he released Wildwood, and he got back to the basics, which is something hopefully Noel Gallagher will do at some point. Radiohead with Pablo Honey, again, it was one of the albums that I kind of inherited from my big brother, I've got to admit. Storm in Heaven by Verve, as you've already mentioned. Gold Against the Soul by the Manics. Love a bit of Tindersticks, Kevin, for make myself feel really depressed and all that kind of stuff. Melancholic. I do love a bit of Tindersticks, I've got to say. And on the other end of the scale, Siamese Dream by Smashing Pumpkins. A couple of other mentions, I would say. You've already spoke about Suede in some depth a few weeks ago on Screamacelica, but I was also a big fan of Bjork, and Bjork released Debut this year as well, so I would have a mention for Bjork. I thought she was one of the artists, that just about anything she touched back then, and she'd done what she wanted, didn't she? She was very influential, and it's just one of the artists, and it takes me back, Big Time Sensuality. Remember that single from the Debut album? So yeah, brilliant time for music. Not so good for Celtic, but it's interesting how we're looking at the Jungle getting torn to pieces. It was like the last throw of the dice by a board who were really faltering, and there was no way they were going to get the stadium in time, part of the Taylor report, but they were promising that they would, and they were just incompetent. And Cassidy just kept saying, we're going to get it done, it will be the best stadium in Europe, but he couldn't actually tell anybody how it was going to be done. I often wonder, Brian Dempsey had one of the stadiums all mocked up like a big model, didn't he, for Rob Royston?
Jim Moore's seen it, eh?
I wonder where that is. I wonder where that model is.
It's quite strange that you mentioned, you were talking about earlier on about modern life being rubbish, and we were talking about Celtic being in a terrible state at that time. But round about this time, I was experiencing an awful lot of firsts at this time. I mean, obviously, I mentioned going to the Reading Festival, my first ever festival. But there's an awful lot of football first. I just started work as well, so I had money, and I was doing going to a lot more away games and that. So I was just thinking there. I mean, you mentioned Sporting Lisbon. My first ever European away trip was the away leg when we got beat 2-0 in Lisbon, and that was my first ever European away leg. And you mentioned Frank Connor's game in charge at Ibrox. That was my first ever trip to Ibrox. So
the 2-1 game.
It's quite. The 2-1 game, eh? So it's quite some bittersweet memories for me, some bittersweet nostalgia there of an absolute terrible period, but of some milestones, of some great times, strangely enough.
Yeah, they were sprinkled with some real great memories. I mean, that game you're talking about, the Sporting Lisbon game, Bobby Robson was in charge of Sporting Lisbon, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. George Cadet scored the 2 goals.
Yeah, and I always remember that was the one manager that I would have loved to have seen managing Celtic, Bobby Robson.
Definitely. His name was always linked, well, especially after this time when you got to between Burns to Janssen and Janssen to Venglos. I mean, I think everybody thought that we were going to get Bobby Robson at one of those occasions, and it just didn't seem to happen.
What a match that would have been. That would have been a match made in heaven. Bobby Robson and Celtic,
He's one of those guys like Tommy Burns that nobody in football has a bad word to say, which is highly unusual nowadays. You ever seen One Night in Turin?
No.
And that's a very good documentary. I would recommend any of the listeners to watch it. Obviously England lose, so there is a happy ending if you're that way inclined. So it's a very, very good documentary.
So this week's recommendations, Kevin, are Elvis Costello with Spectacle. Check it out on YouTube. It's a series of interviews. It's a series of interviews that Costello does with musical influences that he has either come into contact with throughout his career or he cites as influential in his career. And it's part interview, part song. So they might talk about a song and then get up and do a duet, or they might Costello moves to the side and one of the artists will then sing a song. It's brilliant. He's a great interviewer, actually, Elvis Costello, as well as a fantastic artist. We've also mentioned Substance, Inside New Order by Peter Hook. It's quite a tome. I think it's probably about 400 or 500 pages, but a brilliant read. Quite sad how you see the inner workings of a band ruining friendships and relationships that way, Kevin. Quite sad. But the flip side is it allows them to create, music because they're living on the edge of this friendship or relationship about to break down, and they're able to create. That gives them the hunger, I guess, to create the music. And then finally, One Night in Turin, the documentary that you'd mentioned there, going back to a period that you and I have both admitted we didn't mind seeing England doing well in that tournament, even though obviously I was supporting the Republic of Ireland.
Maybe we didn't want them to win it, but we didn't mind them doing well because, as we've said, Bobby Robson made them quite likeable.
Just down to Bobby, that's the caveat, and it's the manager I'd have loved to have seen in the Celtic Park hot seat. However, he wouldn't have taken any of the nonsense from the incompetence in the Celtic board at that stage. So Kevin, an absolute pleasure. Modern life may well indeed be rubbish, and if it is, then hopefully when we get out of this pandemic we can live our modern lives a wee bit better. I look forward to your LP choice next week, Kevin, and until then, take care.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hail, hail.